Noni Madueke or Morgan Rogers, these are the two midfielders on every draft manager's lips this week as they're planning their waivers. We will unpack that in this episode, plus a deep dive into a host of midfielders that are also in the mixer for those waivers. Welcome back to the Draft FC podcast, the podcast website and YouTube channel dedicated to all things official draft FPL. My name is Mitch and I'm your host for another Game Week preview, going over waiver options, hidden gems, general Premier League chat and predicted lineups ahead of Game Week 3. Now, for those of you that may have missed it at the end of the last episode, I mentioned in there that it was a big weekend for us at Draft FC as our very own Draft FC Taz was tying the knot. The whole weekend was incredible. And if you missed out on passing on your best wishes to Taz last week, make sure you drop a comment below and let him know this week. Now, being the consummate professional that Draft FC Taz is, he managed to plan the entire wedding, which was several events, completely around the Premier League football, which meant I was still able to watch pretty much as much football as I normally would do. It does mean I had pretty much zero time for anything else, just about caught up on sleep, but it means I'm nicely prepared to do the Game Week 3 preview. The results went reasonably as expected. The Chelsea lineup and result definitely threw a cat amongst the pigeons and will be a major talking point later on. Now, a lot of the questions this week have had a very similar theme, so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time in the main section today discussing a number of the midfielder options, including all the Chelsea guys, a deep dive on João Felix, because obviously he's now in the game proper. And if this episode was a sandwich, that bit is definitely going to be the meat. So if you do anything, skip ahead to that bit and check that section out. I'm recording this episode on Wednesday, the 28th of August. So any team news, injury developments or press conference information are up to date as of then. And of course, subject to change. There are also a host of early round League Cup matches this week. There were some last night and some tonight, which can obviously cause some injury and selection issues, so we'll have to keep an eye on those. Some of the players that I'll be discussing in this episode include Noni Madueke, Christopher Nkunku, João Felix, Morgan Rogers, plus many more. So let's get straight into it. So a quick reminder right at the top that the waiver deadline this week will process on Friday morning UK time, with the main Game Week deadline on Saturday morning. So let's start with Waiver Watch. So we use the data provided at Draft FC data that is available to anyone who is a signed up member to have a look at the main swings in ownership between Game Week 1 and Game Week 2. So these are the players that you're bringing in on the waivers and in free agency. So let's take a look. The main players coming in, Mazraoui, Danny Welbeck, very good move for those managers, Jamie Vardy, Rico Lewis, Livramento, Joel Linton, Kovacic and Martinez. The players leaving were Fabian Schär, Rodri, Ward-Prowse, Ivan Toney, interesting, Sterling, Quansah, Branthwaite and Awani. I'd say that's a pretty reasonable selection of ins and outs there. In terms of fixtures, there is probably one standout team to mention this week, and that is Aston Villa. Game Week 3 was always the week their fixture run turned around, kicking off with a trip to the King Power to face Leicester. They then have a double home header of Everton and Wolves, who have both struggled early on before a trip to Ipswich in Game Week 6. So any and all options for them are definitely on the table. Elsewhere, Chelsea, Fulham and Ipswich have a nice run coming up, and Wolves and West Ham kind of remain on the bad pile for a few more weeks yet. In terms of injuries and suspensions, there weren't a huge amount this week, which is quite nice for us. Two notable ones. Matty Cash for Aston Villa seems to have done his hamstring and is going to be out for the foreseeable future, so we'll be talking about his replacement later on in this episode. And Gabriel Jesus was missing from the Arsenal squad for their game against Villa with a groin injury. We don't have a huge amount of detail on that, so again, just really devalues him slightly more, and anyone that was thinking about dropping him may have that final nudge this week to do it. So let's get into the main picks. Firstly, let's talk about some defenders. The first one I'm going to mention is Ferdi Kadioglu for Brighton. He's a new Turkish fullback, can play both sides, but generally prefers being left back. Reported fee around £25 million, so it's a pretty decent signing fee, and it's definitely been an area of weakness in the squad, given the reliability issues they've had with some of their current options. I expect him to play. He could be worthy of a short-term punt after the international break for Game Weeks 4 and 5, when Brighton have a home game double of Ipswich, then Forest. but by no means one to rush out for this week. He's been known to score some good goals, but he is by no means prolific in an attacking sense, but there is definitely potential there. The other defenders I'm highlighting are really just the Aston Villa defenders. Maatsen, who I'm going to continue predicting to start until he finally does, Konsa and Pau Torres. Ownership is reasonably high, but I'd say in a lot of leagues out there, you'll be able to find one in the waiver pile. And say, kicking off their lovely fixture run with an away trip to Leicester this weekend, and then players that you could hold for a good few weeks to come. Now, let's talk about the midfielders. This is really the meat I was talking about at the beginning. So, all the chat this week, all the questions that have been coming in revolve around a reasonably tight cluster of kind of merry-go-round players, half of which play for Chelsea. And as I say, I've had so many similar questions, I thought it'd be best to kind of break the mold a little bit here for a moment and talk about these guys in particular depth. So hopefully I can answer the majority of the questions that I've had and questions that will likely come in afterwards. Now, I'm not going to pretend this is going to somehow answer any question that you could conceivably come up with. And there are certainly players on here that have been involved in questions that I'm not going to talk about, the likes of Leandro Trossard, for example, you could have thrown into this mix. But to be honest, I have Trossard rated much higher than a lot of these guys, which is why I'm not bracketing him in this list. Now, when I come on to some of the deeper analysis in a minute, I've taken off Minter for Brighton because I think he's just so much of an unknown. We don't have really much data on him at all, that really comparing him to the likes of Raheem Sterling or Nkunku, who have been around playing in top European football leagues for nearly a decade now, we're kind of comparing apples and oranges here. So I know lots of you will be including him in your thoughts, and if he is in your thoughts, then feel free to leave a question below or DM me on X. But if I had to boil down the questions that I've been getting already into one singular question, it would be this. I have Nkunku. Should I drop him for Madueke or Morgan Rogers? I've had that same exact question numerous times in different iterations already this week. So I think the player that really is throwing the cat amongst the pigeons here is Christopher Nkunku. And I distinctly remember saying at some point over the last few weeks, I don't remember if it was in one of the preseason episodes or in the Game Week 1 preview, for example, that we have to be careful in draft not to put too much emphasis on the content that gets put out for official FPL, the main official FPL game. Because if you follow any of the big accounts, any and all of the big accounts this week, a lot of them had Nkunku in their teams for the start of the season. And the big news from all of them this week is drop Nkunku. Nkunku has to go, he's a sell, and these are the possible replacements, including the likes of Madueke and Morgan Rogers. That is a completely different game. That is a game where you can sell Nkunku this week, and if it turns out in a couple of weeks' time that he's actually the best player in the world, you can just buy him back in without any hesitation. This is draft, and obviously a lot of managers, most managers listening who have Nkunku, would have invested a decent amount of stock into him on draft day. He probably would have gone around the 4th or 5th round. When you looked at your team and when you commented on other draft managers' teams who had Nkunku in the midfield, you'd have had a look at that and gone, yeah, strong. Because when we were doing those valuations before Game Week 1, we were looking at who these big players could be over 38 game weeks. Now, as it stands, we've barely drawn a line under Game Week 2. So for the majority of players here, they haven't even hit 180 minutes of football quite yet. So I do want you to bear that in mind when we go through some of the chat in a minute. And I say afterwards, I'm going to try and sort them out a little bit so that answers a lot of the very basic A or B questions that I've been getting. Before we do that, let's have a little look particularly at João Felix, because as I said, he is the new guy in this week. He was added just around the waiver deadline for Game Week 2, which meant he was locked, and so he will be fresh on the waiver pile for most of you in Game Week 3. Now, João Felix is still only 24 years old, which surprised me. It feels like he's been on the scene for a decade or more. He's versatile, generally plays centrally as either a 9 or a 10. Last season, he had 30 appearances for Barcelona, 7 goals and 3 assists, with a non-penalty expected goal involvement per 90 of 0.7, which is very, very good. Now, obviously, the unique thing of João Felix, which we don't really get very often in terms of new signings in the Premier League, is that we have some relatively recent data of him playing for the club, Chelsea, that he has now signed for again, because he was on loan there the year before in the 22-23 season. Now, he didn't make many appearances that year, but he had 4 goals with an XG of 4.3, and non-penalty expecting goal involvements per 90 of 0.47, which is still very respectable. We look at that over his career, he averages 0.6, which means if he were to play 2 games, on average, he would get an attacking return. So good numbers for Barcelona last year, okay numbers for Chelsea. And obviously the biggest thing we have to highlight is that he's already got 1 goal. So he's got a little bit of a head start on his underlying stats already. The main concern for me really are his minutes. If we look at his main 6 seasons as a senior professional, he's played just under 8,000 minutes, 7,700 minutes overall, which averages to about the equivalent of playing 14 full games a year if you were to divide that by 90. So if we were to then convert that to this season, and this is a huge part of appraising players, is how many minutes do we think they're going to get this year? Now, I've put him somewhere between 14 and 1,800, and if he did hit the top end of that, that would really be one of the most prevalent minute seasons he's had in his entire career. And so if we then use that and do some simple arithmetic with his expected goal involvements, we can plot somewhere between 8 and 11 attacking returns for the season on that basis. Now, for those watching on the video, you'll have just copped an absolute eyeful of numbers. And that clutch of players that I had just before are now represented on screen with a whole host of numbers, which I will talk about, and I'll talk about them clearly for those listening on the audio too. Just to quickly go through the players in question, got Nkunku, João Felix, Neto, Madueke, Savinho for City or Savio, Morgan Rogers, Smith Rowe, Paqueta, Brennan Johnson, Rashford and Sterling. The reason I said I've chosen these players is because these are the ones that seem to be getting talked about a lot in terms of waiver queries and in the questions that we have directly received already this week. And so for those watching on the audio, I will link this table as an image in the description below so you can follow along with that visual if you want to. For those watching on the video and for those who have that up, this is in no particular order currently. I'm going to sort them out in the next slide, but for this, these are in no particular order. So what I've done here, just to explain the headings, we've got the players, we've got their current roster percentage in 8-team leagues, so what percentage of leagues they are currently picked up in. Then we have minutes, non-penalty expected goal involvements per 90, their average draft ranking, and their expected goal involvements for this season based on those numbers. So let's go through that. So if we just start with Nkunku, for example, because he's at the top of the list, currently rostered in 77% of 8-team leagues, so he's barely available if you're in an 8-team league. Last season, he got 416 minutes, but his career average is 1,521. So if I had to project that for this season, I've got him somewhere around 1,600. And then last year, his non-penalty expected goal involvements per 90 was 0.57, with a career average of 0.7, which is very good. And in fact, that is the highest on this list. The other thing to highlight for Nkunku is he currently has that highest average draft ranking of the players on this list. He was averaging pick number 34 overall, which puts him somewhere between the 4th and 5th round if you're in an 8-team league. And if we were to extrapolate those numbers, that puts him somewhere around the 10 mark for expected goal involvements. That includes goals and assists for the season. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these numbers because you can have a look through those yourself. But I've put some of the key ones in bold just to highlight the areas where players have done particularly well. So in terms of minutes last season, Savio played over 3,000 minutes and Paqueta was next with 2,676 for West Ham. So these players were very durable, played a lot of minutes last year. Now Savio is only 20, so that was only his first full senior season in football, which means we don't have any more to average that out for. But for Paqueta, his average is just under 1,800, which is one of the higher ones on the list. So he is a very good and durable option, particularly for West Ham, where he's definitely first choice 11. In terms of a career average, the obvious ones at the bottom, Sterling and Rashford, stand out as playing more than 2,000 minutes a season on average. We had to project forward to this season. Now, this is definitely the most subjective column on the table. I've gone through and I've basically just made these up based on how I see them fitting into their teams. If anyone tells you that there's a fancy way of doing this, they are lying to you, because there is no way at this stage, but just after Game Week 2, you can reliably tell me how many minutes Pedro Neto or Brennan Johnson are going to get this season. So this is very much subjective. It's a large part of just trying to work out how the squads are looking. Obviously, the big caveat, and I haven't mentioned that already, is the transfer window is still open. So a huge amount of this is dependent on who these teams sell or bring in the next couple of days. It's only a couple of days to go before the transfer window shuts. For example, if Chelsea were to go and bring in a marquee number 9, it would affect these minutes massively. And if Sterling moved to United, as is currently rumoured, that would obviously impact Marcus Rashford's minutes massively too. So this is, as I said at the beginning, very much as of Wednesday, 28th of August. in the evening and any news up to date as of then. But anyway, in terms of expected minutes for this upcoming season, the top two I've got are Paqueta and Morgan Rogers for Aston Villa. Now, that is very much dependent on whether or not Villa bring in anyone in the next couple of days. I don't think they're rumoured to. Rogers has been playing excellently. He's also got the back end of last season as a bit of a runway to come into. So I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be a reasonable ever-present in the 11. So 2,500 could be a conservative estimate. If he stays fit and he plays the majority of the season, that could even push towards 3,000. And obviously, when we're evaluating these players over 38 game weeks, it doesn't matter how good they are. If you've got a player like Rogers or Paqueta pushing towards the 3,000 minutes mark, they're easily and comfortably going to outscore a player who's estimated to just play less than half of those minutes. Another interesting stat to highlight is if we look at the non-penalty expected goal involvements per 90 just from last season, I've already highlighted João Felix's impressive return at 0.7. He's not actually the highest number on the list. That number, and to surprise me actually, is Brennan Johnson for Spurs. Last year he recorded a non-penalty expected goal involvements per 90 of 0.83, which is, that means if he were to play 5 games, full 90 minutes, you'd expect 4 attacking returns. That is phenomenal. And if he were to get a similar number of minutes to last year, that puts him as one of the higher projected attacking returns on this list of somewhere around 13-14 mark. Now, the caveat with Johnson is that lately he's looked absolutely atrocious. He was poor in pre-season and he's been poor through the opening 2 game weeks this year. The main thing he's got in his favour as it stands is there isn't really anyone who quite does his job who can comfortably play off the right wing. There's obviously Werner on the left, new signing Odobert on the left, who we'll also talk about later. Son can obviously play on the left. Richarlison can play on the left. In terms of the right side, it's really Johnson and Kulusevski. And Kulusevski seems to be preferred as playing as more of a number 8 on that side. So it would really involve someone like Odobert or Werner being shifted over to the right side to cover Johnson if he wasn't playing. But still, after 2 game weeks, I think the value there, based on those underlying numbers from last year, is too high to drop for a lot of players. The other caveat, though, is that as a Spurs fan, I pretty much watch the full 90 minutes of every Spurs game that gets played. And last season, I thought Brennan Johnson looked pretty atrocious at times. In terms of the general game, the build-up play and just general passing and movement, just always seemed a step below the rest of the team. And at times when the team were poor, it was like playing with 10 men. But despite that, he was continuing to pop up in the box with tap-ins and crosses and getting those goal involvements in order to get the underlying stats that we see recorded here on the screen. So whatever he's doing, he still manages to find a way to pop up in the box at the right time, which is definitely something I know Postecoglou will value and continue to value without anyone, as I said, who's a real like for him on the right side. Sterling is another interesting player to comment too here. Now, the current rumour is that he could be on his way to Man United. What that means for the starting 11 at United, obviously he plays exactly the same position as Rashford generally. Whether they could play together, whether they share the minutes, could impact both of them. But he's been so reliable over more than a decade now, in his time at Liverpool, City, Chelsea. So always can play the majority of the season. Very solid, consistent average goal output. And I think would be a pretty good addition for United, given the squad makeup they have as it stands. What that does for you, if you're holding Sterling, really is up to you. You could decide to hold him through Game Week 3, hold him through the end of the transfer deadline, see where he ends up. Obviously, if he's still at Chelsea come that, he's pretty much useless. But if he does get that move to United, you might want to hold on to him for a bit and see how he does there. As I said right at the top, the 2 key names that are coming up this week are Morgan Rogers and Noni Madueke, and I wonder why that is. Obviously, for Madueke, he's coming off the back of a hat-trick. We have to take that hat-trick with a pinch of salt. That Wolves defence in the second half might as well have not been there. And obviously, if you can see the highlights, you might think that the video is skipping. It's 3 pretty much identical goals, 3 identical assists. The whole build-up was exactly the same. The defence just didn't learn. They were just fully up the pitch, so open, almost like they've had a player or 2 sent off, and the rest of the team was just up the pitch. So, Madueke is not going to be doing that every single week. Morgan Rogers is obviously on the agenda because of how good he looked on the eye test in that Villa game against Arsenal. Obviously, Villa came away with a 2-0 defeat, so Rogers didn't get any attacking returns in that game, but he's certainly showing that he could be a really big player for them up alongside Ollie Watkins. And I think that's the other key thing there, is his positioning. He is really playing as that most advanced midfielder apart from the central striker and Watkins. Watkins has hardly set the game alight so far after the opening couple of weeks. But if Rogers can just flick that switch and get some attacking returns going, he could really turn into this season's Cole Palmer. I say the one edge he does have over Madueke is if you're planning this over 38 game weeks potentially, I expect him to get far more minutes than Madueke does. But anyway, let's sort some of these out for you. So what I've done here, because again, this is draft, so we have to add caveat after caveat. And one of those caveats that is almost impossible to apply in content like this is the size of your league. So if you're in a 4-team league or a 16-team league, this chat is going to talk to you in a far different way than it would be if you're in an 8-team league or a 10-team league. So do have to bear that in mind. So what I've done here is I've listed those players in 3 columns. So it's the same set of players, but I've done purely for this game week. So just thinking about game week 3 and not thinking anywhere beyond that, how I would rank them. I've then chosen a kind of medium-term amount of time, so over the next 6 game weeks, so that would be game weeks 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and then a total season projection. Now, if you look at the draft rankings on Draft FC that we update, the ones that you would have used if you remember for draft day, those rankings are predominantly looking from now until the end of the season, because that's just the most appropriate way to rank players, just looking at a random list. So that's what that is. So in terms of pure game week 3, I think the questions are reasonable between Madueke and Rodgers. I think they are the best 2 on this list. I don't put a lot between them, but if I had to choose one for you, it would be Madueke. I just think he's got the proven goal returns that Rodgers hasn't got yet. And that's obviously taking into account Rodgers having a safer spot in the starting 11 for now and the rest of the season. But I think purely for game week 3, I fully expect Madueke to start again. How can you drop a player that's just got a hat-trick? And he is really the form player there. So if we're purely looking for game week 3, Madueke and Rodgers. No surprise to see Sterling at the bottom and the rest somewhere in the middle. If we're looking at the next 6 game weeks, I still have Madueke at the top. And that is because out of the clutch of Chelsea players, he is the one I am most assured of minutes. So he is at the top. Interestingly, you'll see there, João Felix is currently number 2. And that's not because I think he's going to start each of the next 6 games, but I think he's going to start enough and be able to make enough of the opportunities that he's given off the bench too, with Rodgers just behind, still up there in number 3. So still a very good pick for the medium term as well. Neto and Nkunku are slightly lower on the list. Partly this is because I still don't know whether Chelsea are going to bring in a number 9. As it stands, if we just try and map out the options in their squad, currently as a number 9, you've got Nico Jackson, and you could say that João Felix is a rotation option there. In a number 10 spot, I would put Palmer there with Nkunku as his main rotation option. Obviously, Palmer can play off the right. On the right side, Madueke is there. Palmer can cover. And aside from that, there isn't a huge number of players that can play on that right side. On the left side, though, you have got Madueke, who started last week. You have got Sterling, potentially if he sticks around. You have got Neto, who came on as a substitute in that game. Nkunku can also play off the left. And João Felix has also been known to play off the left occasionally, but I don't think that's going to be an option in a Chelsea shirt. So the minutes on that left-hand side are far less assured. If I knew everyone would stay fit for the rest of the year, Neto, I think, would nail down that spot. But he has just got so many issues on the injury front. It's why if you look at my season-long projections, I have Neto in at number 11. That's not because I think he's a bad player. I think he's a brilliant player when he's on the pitch. But I couldn't tell you hand on heart now he's going to play more than 10 games this season. If somebody came back in a time machine and said, Pedro Neto makes 20 appearances for Chelsea this season, then he's way up the list. But I can't have that kind of assurity that he's going to play that much. The other thing, looking at the season projection as a whole of this list, I've got Paqueta as my number 1, just purely because of the number of minutes he's going to play, the fact that he's on penalties. Madueke up there because I think ultimately out of these lot of Chelsea players, he will play the most. And then Brennan Johnson is creeping up the list too with Rodgers. I think Johnson will end up playing less minutes than Rodgers, but based on those underlying stats, should get more attacking returns. Savio is an interesting one. I've kind of got him floating around in the middle of this pack. He could really go either way, but I think for him in particular, the fact that Oscar Bob got injured is really going to give him a boost in terms of minutes, certainly up until Christmas. Obviously on the left-hand side, it's a bit more congested with Grealish and Doku over there, but I think Savio is going to get a decent number of minutes from now until December at the very least, and that obviously gives him a good platform if he's in good form to carry on with a decent run until the end. And let's just sum up on Nkunku, because I don't think I've really covered him properly when mentioning him a moment ago. The thing to consider is if you own Nkunku, you will have spent a pretty decent high draft pick for him. When you did that, you would have been plotting where you think Nkunku fits in from game week 1 to game week 38. Now, at that point, you wouldn't have had the information that João Felix was signing. And that's probably the biggest factor that's affected his value. So already he's gone down a couple of pegs. If you were to factor in another number 9 arriving, that would knock him down even further, because then you could argue Nkunku becomes third choice as the number 10 with Palmer, Felix, and then him in the pecking order. So then if that happened, you would probably be factoring in Nkunku into the rotation off the left. And this is all assuming they play with an attacking 4 in a 4-2-3-1. So he would then be sharing minutes with Neto and occasionally Madueke, but probably Neto for the majority of the season. So I think if we were drafting now, that average draft pick of around 36 would probably become 56. It would be a good 2 rounds lower than it currently is. That is, unless you have particularly strong feelings that he's actually going to push those guys aside and actually be one of the main players in that team. So he's an excellent player. He's got European leading stats at times in terms of his expected goal involvements. Contrary to what we've seen of him in the Premier League, he's not actually that injury prone. He's got pretty strong seasons before that, but as I said, the arrival of Felix has probably put him as a 2,000 plus minutes projection to as I've put him down as around 1,600 minutes sharing with the others. And similar to Neto, he's another one. If somebody came back in a time machine and said the season just finished and Nkunku got 20 appearances, started 20 games for Chelsea, then he'd be way up the list. So if you're asking me, should I drop so-and-so for so-and-so, if they are 2 players on these lists, just simply look at what time frame you're looking at doing it over, and if one's above the other, then my answer is yes. If you're looking at 2 players who are right next to each other on this list, that means there is virtually nothing to separate between them. So if you're actually looking at them going, I think I'd rather have the player just below that player on the list, then fine, stick with them. This is incremental differences, and a lot of this is pure guesswork, particularly with the fact that the transfer window hasn't even shut yet. So that's enough of those midfielders. Let's talk about a couple of forwards in the main section. First one is Danny Welbeck. His ownership is 53% in 8-team leagues, so he's available in around half, but much higher ownership in 10-team leagues. What an opening to the season for that man Welbs. 2 goals and an assist already, 21 FPL points, puts him in the top 3 through the opening 2 game weeks. Putting those output numbers to one side for a second, just his performance in the eye test in that United game was very impressive, and his job of being both the foil during the build-up play and the guy finishing off those moves too, just perfectly executed. And I think he did exactly the kind of job I expect they've brought Jorginho Rutter in to do too, but I think he'll struggle to get in the team at this rate. So Welbeck is a must-own. He's a must-pick-up in an 8-team league. He's definitely in the top 24 strikers. And then the second one is Eddie Nketiah. Ownership up around the third to half-owned, depending on your league size. Obviously, the main reason he's being backed is because of an imminent move, and it looks like he is not going to be moving to Forest, as was previously rumoured. That's all off. It looks highly likely that he's going to be a Crystal Palace player before the weekend. This obviously impacts another guy who was particularly hot on our radars in pre-season, and that is Jean-Philippe Mateta. Now, just to wave the flag for Mateta quickly, in terms of all competitions, since Glasner took over in February, Mateta has scored 15. The only player in the Premier League who has scored more than that is Erling Haaland. So very much an informed player. Regardless, the arrival of a big money number 9 has to reduce his value somewhat. If you were drafting today, Mateta would not be as high on the boards as he was a couple of weeks ago. But he remains fairly similarly placed in my forward rankings overall. It's just in the total list, he is slightly lower. Now, Nketiah's value is only to those really needing a regular starter in their front line if you're missing one. And I would not advocate swapping Nketiah in for the likes of Muniz, Füllkrug, Cunha, Højlund, Visser, João Pedro, Welbeck, Vardy, Evan Nilsson, Wood, Strand Larsen, and before everyone asks, that also includes Gakpo, who I still have above a lot of those that I just listed, because again, it's only 2 game weeks in. I still expect Gakpo to have a decent showing this season, and that's despite the rumour of the arrival of Chiesa. Now, he won't be in the game before the waivers, so I'm not going to chat about him this week at all. And for those of you wondering, God, that's just another player off the left, I've got a sneaky suspicion Chiesa's brought in for a bit more depth, who can also cover Salah on the right side if they need to, because otherwise that means one of their left-sided attackers could leave. Let's talk about some hidden gems then. So these are players with generally less than 10% ownership in the majority of draft leagues. Now, I didn't do a slide for the goalkeepers, but there are a couple to mention. Ramsdale is one. It seems like there could be a transfer in the offing of him moving to Southampton, which would see him become an instant starter there. It's a little bit harsh on the injured Bazunu, who was the number one, but I don't think Southampton can afford to wait. And so, yeah, if you've got a non-starting goalkeeper, Ramsdale is definitely an option. The other one who could be an option for you is Johnston, owned to just 5%. Looks like he's going to move from Palace to Wolves. Not as clear a situation, and for whatever reason, there's been murmurings about Jose Sarr being demoted from the number one spot at Wolves quite a while now, and so Johnston's obviously been brought in to provide competition. I'm calling it competition for now, as from where I'm sitting, I don't see it as any real upgrade there, but he's no doubt there'll be some well-chosen stats to back up why a move like this was necessary. Hopefully we get some clarity over the international break, but I would guess Johnston starts after that if he does make the move as reported. And the way the Wolves' defence was last week, this is really, again, one only for those larger leagues where you're lacking a starting goalkeeper. Otherwise, it's not one you need to rush out for. In terms of defenders, I finally cleared off the list of Forest defenders except for Milenkovic. Now, interestingly, Milenkovic's ownership went down a touch in Game Week 2, and that's probably because he didn't play in Game Week 1. First start, clean sheet, expected goal involvement of 1 from that game from 3 shots. He looks like an excellent prospect, and there's still one more week of Forest's nice opening run if you're looking for a short-term streamer in defence with their game against Wolves, and I'm fairly certain his ownership will creep up to some degree this week. The other players to highlight are Colwill and Wesley Fofana for Chelsea. Say what you want about the front half of the Chelsea team, as we've already covered. One thing we can seemingly rely on, though, is the back 5. And at the heart of that defence is Colwill and Fofana, who very much have the potential to forge a pretty strong relationship there. Fofana has, of course, been at Chelsea a little while now. Would have likely seen more of him but for injuries, but he has that kind of new signing vibe whilst having his feet firmly under the table at Stamford Bridge now. Their next fixtures are Palace at home, Bournemouth away, West Ham away, Brighton at home, Forest at home. Means it could be nice little medium-term pickups to see you through the international break and beyond. The last one on the list is Rico Lewis, but to be honest, his ownership is really hotting up. His performances have been really good, and as it stands, I don't see Walker walking straight back into that 11. In terms of some hidden gem midfielders, Breton Diaz is an option for Southampton, seems to be playing in that two-pronged attack with Adam Armstrong, if you can call it an attack, that is. They're away to Brentford this week. Tielemans, now this is really an expected narrative pick. The expected narrative stat gets its first outing of the season. This is one of those intangibles, as you Yanks like to call them, a stat that exists on a higher plane of existence than XG and heat maps and all that malarkey. This is where we can highlight those sometimes small but significant narrative threads that can exist for individual players on their journey through life. And Tielemans plays for Aston Villa. Aston Villa are a good side, can smash most teams on their day. And this weekend they're up against Leicester, the club that really introduced us to Tielemans, having made 195 senior appearances for the Foxes. This will be his first encounter against his old side, and he will want to show what he's got back at the King Power Stadium. Probably one more for the 12, 14 or 16 team leagues to consider for a one-week punt, but the rest can ignore. There won't be another one I've mentioned there with their fixture away at Ipswich. Pretty good showing so far from the opening 2 game weeks and pretty good availability across most draft leagues. And then finally, a couple of forwards that exist in hidden gem territory. Strand Larsen is clinging on to hidden gem territory for dear life, as is Delap. Definitely Strand Larsen is the one to look out for there. Got his first goal in game week 2. First goal always makes a player popular in the waivers. There were lots of questions last week asking about Larsen versus Evan Nilsson. I preferred, and I do prefer, Evan Nilsson. Definitely 1-0 to Larsen so far, but the season is long. Larsen has one game week over Evan Nilsson already. And when we're usually appraising these strikers, we're doing it over a season, not just for a week or 2. Next, the most hidden gem section. So this is a player owned in less than 10% of 16-team draft leagues. And I've cheated slightly this week because I thought there were 2 pretty good standout picks. One more exciting than the other, but we'll take them in turn. The first one is Costa Nedeljkovic for Aston Villa. Now, he is going to be the main replacement for Cash, providing Konsa doesn't move back out to the right side, but it seems they're reasonably set on Konsa being the right-sided centre-back. So he is 1% rostered in 16-team draft leagues, so he's pretty much available for all of you. He's an 18-year-old right-back, plenty of appearances in pre-season. In fact, some were touting him to start in game week 1, and he comes in right at the start of their excellent fixture run with the next game, as I just said, away at Leicester. So a huge option there. He's going to be a huge option really regardless of the size of draft league you're in. Even if you're in an 8-team or even a 6-team draft league, if you're streaming defenders and you want a piece of the Aston Villa defence and the rest are gone, he's your way in. And the slightly more exciting pick is Wilson Odobert for Spurs, who made his debut last week against Everton. He's 5% rostered in 16-team leagues, so again, very good availability. Got 65 minutes in that game against Everton. It was a promising start. He did exactly what he's been billed to do, which is to put his head down and get past players. Didn't really turn into many expected goal involvements. That's obviously something his decision-making and his link-up with the team hopefully will get better as the season goes on. Next fixture is a tough one away at Newcastle. Whether he starts that one, I'm not convinced. I currently do have him penciled into my expected 11 for that game because I kind of think Ange is just going to go for it. But I think if you're in a 16-team league, having a player like Odobert that could even come on for 30 minutes is still a very valuable player to own. Next, we come to the get rid list. Now, because this is going to be quite a long episode, I'm not going to spend too much time going through these. I'm going to rattle through them quite quickly. Joe Gomez, owned in nearly 70% of 8-team leagues, needs to go. Kiwior, 60%, he needs to go. He could be third or fourth left centre-back at Arsenal, maybe even fourth or even fifth choice left-back there now. So he needs to go. He-Chan is a controversial one. I know lots of you would have drafted him high. I did in one of my own draft leagues, but he looks well off it. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets dropped this week. Ward-Prowse is definitely not first choice 11 at West Ham. He needs to go. McAllister doesn't look really close enough to the attacking returns. He needs to go. Kovacic isn't really a good draft asset and he needs to go too. Madueke is another one. I don't think he's going to start many more games in the league for Chelsea. And the last one is Gabriel Jesus. His ownership is 89% in 8-team leagues. The situation feels exactly as it was last year, and I'm not sure what we might expect to change that sees him become a mainstay in the Arsenal team again. He can cover anywhere along the front line, but with everyone fit, I don't really see where he does fit in. A frustrating own, can certainly come off the bench and be productive, but for most weeks, he is going to let you down. I think overall, he's going to lose you more head-to-head matchups than he wins for you. Into trade talk, just one thing I'm going to highlight here. This was a message I got last week from one of our followers, Dominic. Now, I've sponsoring here, I'll read it out to you. He said, just watch your vid about Tony. I have a guy who wants him in a trade as he thinks he doesn't leave. The trade is, I'm getting Maupay, Luis Diaz, Vardiol. He will be getting Tony, Leon Bailey and Stones. What are your thoughts? Now, the bit he's caveated in that is that he has first waiver claim that week. So he was obviously bottom of the league, which meant in getting Maupay in the trade, he was actually just getting somebody he could waiver out. And in this instance, he was going to bring in Evan-Nielsen. So actually the trade becomes Tony, Bailey and Stones for Evan-Nielsen, Luis Diaz and Vardiol, which when you look at it that way is an absolute no-brainer. This is an excellent example of a tactic that I often advise people to do where they're stuck because they might have 3 good forwards and they're not sure which one to drop, or they've got 5 half-decent mids and they're not sure which one to drop, is to look for an upgrade elsewhere. Trade one of them away for a player that you don't care about so you can then waiver that player out in return. The one thing I would say, just as a little caveat, is it does depend on how you've got your trade set up in the league. So if you've got a free-for-all, if all trades just go through instantly, you can trade players and waiver them out in the same week. But for other leagues, if you have any kind of veto system set up, the processes around the waiver deadline, then obviously those players won't be in your team in order to waiver them out until the following week. And so that tactic may not work perfectly. So let's have a quick look at the predicted lineups. And I'm going to make it a quick look at the predicted lineups because this episode is going on far, far too long. So for those following on the audio, you can simply go to draftfc.co.uk, whether you're a member or not, and click on our predicted lineups there. And you can see these. Now, I could have updated these between the time that I've recorded and the time that you're listening, but I don't think very much will change. For Arsenal, I'm not predicting much change at all. The same for Aston Villa, apart from that swap we just discussed with Cash Out and Nedeljkovic in. For Bournemouth, Evan-Nielsen came straight in game week 2, so I expect him to go back in game week 3. For Brentford, not much change. I don't expect Brighton to change. The only real difference could be in the centre of midfield. I thought Gilmour had an excellent game. Vifo was injured, so Milner played too. I mean, Milner had an excellent game too. It's just his engine kind of lets him down as the game goes on, and his finishing was a bit tired. I wonder if a pairing of Wiffer and Gilmour could be a real excellent pairing there, giving them loads of legs and the passing potential there, but we'll have to wait and see. I've also tipped Kadioglu to go straight in at left back, which could move Hinchelwood over to his more preferred right back, but I'm not totally sure about that. For Chelsea, I've gone with Nico Jackson, Madueke and Neto starting in the front line, with the rest pretty much unchanged. Palace, it just remains to be seen whether Guehi's there or not. For Everton, I believe Coleman played in their League Cup game, so I expect he'll come back in at right back. And I think they have to get Ndiaye in up top, because otherwise they just lack any creativity. There is no one that can really carry the ball, keep the ball and drive them upfield, because Calvert-Lewin is just not doing that job. So I think he has to start sooner rather than later. Fulham I've left unchanged. Obviously their big new signing is Anderson. He played in midweek 2 in their League Cup game. So I expect the team to stay reasonably unchanged for this one. And I think in game week 4, we could see Anderson come in place of Bassi. Ipswich, I think, will revert to their normal formation. Not much to talk about for Leicester. I think Liverpool carry on unchanged. City, there is little to change there. The only thing would be whether Kovacic is fit. Rodri sounds like he could be out until after the international break. For United, I've got De Ligt coming in to start and Xerxes too. The rest I see leaving as it is. For Newcastle, again, pretty much unchanged too. The same for Forest, the same for Southampton, the same for Spurs. As the only difference that could happen for Spurs depends on whether they want to set up a little bit more defensively. And by that would involve dropping either Johnson or Odobert, Kulusevski coming into the front line, and someone like Assar or Bentancur going in to shore up the midfield a little bit. For West Ham, I think we will see a couple of changes. I think this will be the first game that Füllkrug starts. I think Wan-Bissaka will start. Todibo could start, but that may be one change too many. We'll have to wait and see. For Wolves, something has to change there, definitely. Now, I've currently got them going into like a 4-3-3 with one of the forwards dropping. I've got Hechan dropping, as I discussed, and Doyle coming in to add a bit more solidity in the middle. The other way they could change would be to go to a back 3 or a back 5, but I don't think Gary O'Neill wants to play with a back 5. I think he wants a back 4. Dawson obviously could come in to add some solidity, but to be honest, I think it was more of a system problem than any individual errors there. That's really not one I'm sure about, but also, to be honest, not one I think that's going to massively impact the majority of you listening. So that is it for this episode. Apologies for the slightly longer episode again. I know those of you that will have been used to listening to the podcast for a few years now will have grown quite accustomed to some nice short 10 to 15 minute episodes, but there's just a lot to talk about at the moment, especially why the transfer window is still open. If you enjoyed this video, if this is your first time here or not, do consider hitting the subscribe button if you want more draft FPL content as the season goes on, and give us a thumbs up if you found anything in this episode useful. Of course, comment below if there's anything you want to know about your own situation, and I will respond to any and all questions. If you'd rather do it in a slightly more private way, you can also DM us on X. Give us a follow over there at draft_FC. All the links are below as well. Of course, the other main thing to see you towards is our website, draftfc.co.uk. As you'd have just heard, we do predicted lineups every week for any and all people that want to skim by and have a look. But if you're a signed up member, you get loads more features that you can't get anywhere else, including all of the roster stats that I mentioned in these episodes, a completely built-in functionality with your own draft league, analytics, monthly reports, a waiver planner, global league rank, all sorts of there. $3.99 a month. It's basically the cost of a cup of coffee each month. You get helpful stuff for your draft league and you help support the channel. And for those that are already signed up, I know there's been a few questions about some of the new features coming in the waiver planner. Of course, because of said wedding that I've mentioned, things have been a little bit slow on the development side, but things will be back cracking over the next week or two, and all of that should be ready by the other side of the international break. So I'm going to leave things there. We'll wait and see how much activity there is in the transfer window over the next couple of days as to whether or not we need to do an interim pod in the international break, or whether we can just wait and save it all for the Game Week 4 preview. But until then, best of luck for your waivers and your head-to-head matchups and leagues for this week. And as always, stay shook.